Hello everyone, this is John with Siptopia.org. Welcome to the RFC 3261 Simplified series, part 7. In this tutorial, let's take a look at invite requests to find out how sessions are created, terminated, and session parameters are exchanged. While the terms session and dialog are often used interchangeably, and even though there is a strong relation between the two, they are two different concepts. Perhaps dialogues should be our starting point for this section. Going back to the jungle, let's discuss the dialogue and session concepts with a sample call from Tarzan to Jane, while keeping in mind a few points from RFC 3261 simplified tutorials. Well, first of all, the order of header fields doesn't matter if the header fields are different type, but it is important when they are the same type. There's a tag parameter in toHeader field, which signifies a peering relation. Naturally, the initial invite request does not have the tag parameter, and the first time this tag parameter appears is when the caller receives a response from the called party. Alright guys, let's take a look at our sample call here. As you can see, we are running 3 VirtualBox instances here. One of them is an asterisk now PBX in the middle. We are running our Wireshark, and let's restart it and call Jane. As you can see, we are using the SFL phone. Let's calling Jane. We do see our call showing up in the Wireshark. Alright, we see the call on the other virtual machine on the Jane's side. Let's answer the call. As you can see, we are using G711. Let's hang up the call and go back to our Wireshark to stop it. So let's use the call ID here to filter our capture so that we can just focus on our call. As you can see, the first initial invite receives a 401 unauthorized response. We acknowledge it, and then we send another invite. It is still an initial invite, but now with an authorization header field. Now the call is processed. There is no to tag here because it's 100 trying from the asterisk PBX. Now here we do see the tag in the 180 ringing because it's coming from Jane's phone. So Jane answers. We receive a 200 OK. As you can see in our message body, we have some codec options all listed here. The trying doesn't have a message body, ringing doesn't have a message body, and 200 OK does have a message body similar to the invite, listing different codecs that Jane's phone supports. Heading back to our presentation, let's use some analogies while going through that call to understand the concepts better. So if Tarzan is talking to himself in the jungle, is that a dialogue? No, it's a monologue. If Tarzan is talking to a wall and receiving an echo, is that a dialogue? No, it's a monologue. It's only a dialogue if Tarzan is talking to and hearing from Jane. Well, what if Tarzan is speaking in German and Jane is speaking in English? This is still a dialogue, but we don't have a proper session established for them to communicate properly. Alright, so the initial invite from Tarzan's SIP phone doesn't have a tag parameter in the toHeader field, as the phone hasn't heard from Jane's phone yet. There is no peering relation, there is no dialog. The first provisional response Tarzan's phone receives is 100 trying from the back-to-back user agent. Has the phone heard from Jane's phone yet? No. Back-to-back user agent just indicates that it is trying to reach Jane's phone. Obviously, the 100 trying response also doesn't have the tag parameter in the to header field. There is no peering relation, there is no dialog. This is similar to Tarzan talking to a wall and hearing an echo. Now, 180 ringing is a different story. Jane's SIP phone is providing Jane a visual and/or audio alert, and it is letting Tarzan's phone know. This is the first time Tarzan's phone hears from Jane's phone. Therefore, the to header field has a tag parameter. Since Tarzan's phone has exchanged SIP messages with Jane's phone, we can now claim that we have a dialog. To be precise, this is called early dialog, as it is a result of a provisional response. Well, Tarzan's phone and Jane's phone now have a dialog, but have they determined which codec or RTP port to use? No. This is similar to the analogy we made with speaking in German versus speaking in English. We have a dialogue, but we do not have a session established yet. Later, Jane answered the phone and Tarzan's phone received a 200 OK response. This means two changes in the call. The early dialogue is now called confirmed dialogue, and there is a session established. In other words, Tarzan and Jane agreed on speaking a common language and can start communicating properly. As we have just discussed, even though there is a strong relation between the two, the dialogue and session are two different concepts. Now, let's move on to the common origin of the two, the invite request. In order for a user agent client to start an audio or video call with a user agent server, the user agent client sends an invite request to the user agent server. In our previous tutorials, regardless of the method used, we covered how a request is created, which sections are mandatory, which are optional, and where and how the requests are sent. The additional items to take into consideration in case of invite requests are the following. Allow header field should be present to indicate which methods can be used by the user agent client. Supported header fields should be present to indicate which extensions can be used by the UAC. So other than the two header fields that should be present, there are two that may be present. Except header field may be present to indicate which content types can be used by the UAC. Expires header field may be present to indicate how long the user agent client will wait for a final response before canceling the request. Now, the message body may be present to indicate which session parameters can be used by the user agent client. Unlike the previous maybe statements, there's a condition here. If the initial invite doesn't have the message body, the 200 OK response from the user agent server and the ACK request from user agent client will have to have a message body. Which takes us to the offer and answer mechanism. Similar to how SIP is based on request, response, message exchanges, it also uses an offer-answer mechanism to determine the medium, whether it's audio, video, or a game, and parameters like codecs, ports, IP addresses, and so on to use for the session. In RFC 3261, offers and answers are only included in invite requests, 1xx provisional, 2xx success responses, and ACK requests. Going back to how a condition applies to the may be included message body, there are two options to include the offer and answer mechanism, and one of them has to be used. So if the initial invite has an offer, the 2xx response must have an answer. Provisional responses received prior to the 2xx response could also include the exact same answer. If the initial invite does not have an offer, the 2xx response must have an offer. As a result, the ACK request after the 2xx response must also have an answer. These invite request offers and answers use session description protocol, and every user agent must support SDP. In this case, the content type header field value would be application/SDP, which is the default value if the header field doesn't exist. Well, we have created the invite request using the non-method specific rules covered in earlier tutorials and the invite method specific rules we have just mentioned. Sending the invite request follows the same procedure other requests follow, which was, again, covered in previous tutorials. Now, let's discuss the responses user agent client could get as a result of this invite request, unless it receives no response, in which case the user agent client would consider this a 408 request timeout situation. One or more 1xx provisional responses could be received, simply indicating the progress of the call. As we discussed earlier, user agent client could also receive a 1xx response with a tag in the to header field, which would create an early dialog between the UAC and UAS. A 3xx redirect response could be received, possibly providing the UAC other contact addresses to reach the UAS. 4xx, 5xx, and 6xx responses are final. Therefore, if one of these is received, the transaction is terminated. This means the early dialog, if there is one, is also terminated. An ACK request would be sent out to the UAS to finalize this SIP exchange. Well, a 2xx response is always welcome as it indicates a successful process. If the 200 OK included an answer to an offer, the session parameters are agreed on. It's great. If, however, 200 OK included an offer, and if the UAC doesn't like that offer, what then? UAC would simply follow the offer and answer procedure discussed before and send an ACK request with its answer, immediately followed by a buy request to tear down the session. Of course, if the 200 OK included an offer and the UAC is compatible, the ACK request will still have an answer and the session will be established successfully. We now have a decent understanding of possible outcomes on the user agent client side after an invite request has been sent and a response has been received. Well, what happens on the user agent server side when it receives an invite request? In previous tutorials, we went over the steps a user agent server follows to check the request independent of its method. The main addition here, in the case of an invite method check, is whether or not an expires header field is present. We are also familiar with the expires header field from the tutorial about register request. The same concept pretty much applies here. If an invite request has been received and an expires header field is present, user agent server starts a timer. If the timer expires before the user agent server could generate a final response for the invite request, the request is considered to be expired and the UAS responds with a 487 request terminated response. As we discussed earlier, if the invite request has an offer, the response, whether it's provisional or final, will have to have an answer. On the other hand, if the invite request doesn't have an offer, the response will have to have an offer, which in return requires an ACK request with an answer from the user agent client. Now, the possible responses from the user agent server could be grouped into 4: progress, redirect, reject, and accept. Progress pretty much refers to the provisional responses, 1xx. A user agent server could send as many provisional responses as it desires. Important point here is that some SIP proxies could cancel a request if there is a 3-minute gap between the responses. Therefore, if multiple provisional responses are going to be sent, they have to be higher than 100, and the user agent server must send these periodically every minute in order to avoid cancellation with the possibility of a lost provisional response. Well, the 4xx, 5xx, 6xx error responses, the reject stage, have been explained in earlier tutorials, but as it relates to this section, it is worth discussing 486, 488, and 600. If the user is not willing to answer the call, or if the user is busy, user agent server could respond with a 486 busy here. If it's a global error and the user agent server knows that the user is not available anywhere else, the response could be a 600 busy everywhere. Since it is highly unlikely that a user agent server knows every single user agent server in the environment and whether or not a user is available in those, 600 busy everywhere is rarely used. Going back to the offer and answer mechanism, if the invite request has an offer that is not acceptable by the user agent server, the user agent server could respond with a 488 not acceptable here response, possibly with a warning header field explaining the part in the offer that resulted in this response. Naturally, if the invite request is accepted, the user agent server responds with a 2xx response. Similar to the invite request, the 2xx response should include an allow header field to list the methods and the supported header field to list the extensions supported by the user agent server. An accept header field may also be present. Even though it has been already repeated multiple times, let's note that if the invite request had an offer, the 2xx response must have an answer. If the invite request did not have an offer, the 2xx response must have an offer and expect an ACK request with an answer. There's one more point that is really worth mentioning here. If the user agent server sends a 2xx response, we are not done. It's not the party time yet. The user agent server now expects an ACK request from the user agent client. The user agent server will keep retransmitting the 2xx response until a timer is hit. Now, just for the record, this is the B timer that's equal to 64 multiplied by T1, another timer, which will be discussed in one of the upcoming tutorials. If the timer expires, the UAS does not send an error response, it sends a buy request. Before we move on to terminating calls with buy requests, it might have caught your attention that we always use the word initial for invite requests. That was in order to indicate that the invite request was out of dialog. In other words, the invite request was creating a new dialog. Well, if there is an out of dialog invite request concept, there must be an in dialog invite request, aka reinvite concept also. The easiest way to simulate a call with an out of dialog invite request as well as an in dialog invite request is asking our Tarzan to call Jane again, and after the call is established, asking him to put her on hold. Well, let's do that. Alright, let's use our setup here to call Jane from Tarzan's phone. Here we simply type Jane. See the call captured in Wireshark. We have the call hit Jane's phone. Once we answer the phone, as you can see, the call is established. So let's use the call ID here to filter this Wireshark capture just to focus on our call. If we expand this window a little, you can see the complete picture with an ACK at the end. So, as we discussed, let's go ahead and put the call on hold. What do you know? We see another invite request from Tarzan to Jane. Back to our presentation. As the following call flow demonstrates, Tarzan calls Jane and his initial invite request gets a 401 unauthorized response indicating that he needs to add credentials to the invite request. The user agent client follows up with an ACK request. This was a transaction and it's now over. The next message is another initial invite request, in other words, out of dialog invite request with the proper credentials. This time, the invite request is processed and finally Jane answers the call. The following invite request, well, thanks to Wireshark, it is obvious now, cannot be called an initial invite request. It's an in-dialog invite request to modify parameters. In this example, we modified the audio flow from two-way to one-way by putting Jane on hold, but anything in the session parameters could be changed with an in-dialog invite request, including endpoints, ports, codecs, and so on. Let's take a closer look at these messages. The first invite request has the C sequence value of 27297 and the to header field does not have a tag as expected. The next invite request has the C sequence value of 27298, which makes you think it's in dialog as it's not another random number. However, the to header field doesn't have a tag, therefore there is no dialog. This is again an initial invite request. Even though Wireshark ruins the surprise by describing the next invite request as in dialog, let's take a look at the message details. The C sequence value is 27299, which makes us realize it's in dialog as it is not another random number. Now the to header field also has a tag, indicating that a peering relation already exists In other words, the invite request is in dialog. Another possible way to distinguish the out of dialog and in dialog invite request is the session version number if it exists. For example, the initial invite request here has the version number of 0. And the session version is now increased by 1 to indicate that this invite request is in dialog. Earlier, we briefly mentioned the fact that a lot of session parameters could be changed with an in dialog invite request. Let's take a look at the message body in this request to find out what happens when you put someone on hold. Well, first of all, a successful call here should allow both sides to listen and hear each other. The highlighted media attribute in this offer is self-explanatory and it makes perfect sense. As expected, the 200 OK response also has the same value for this media attribute. Now the re-invite request from Tarzan wants to change this media attribute to send only, as Tarzan just put Jane on hold. Tarzan will not be hearing Jane, whereas Jane could hear optional music. Consistent with the re-invite request, the 200 OK response now has an answer with this parameter set to receive only. Basically, Jane's phone agreed to hear optional music but not be able to talk to Tarzan. A few important points to note here are: the re-invite request doesn't just include the parameter proposed to be changed. It includes all other parameters, just like the initial offer answer exchange. This is done to accommodate stateless entities. Moreover, non-2xx final responses for re-invite requests do not terminate the sessions. Endpoints pretend like the re-invite never happened when this failure occurs. The exceptions are 481 call transaction doesn't exist, 408 request timeout, and no response situations which terminate the sessions. This makes sense as the 408 request timeout and no response mean the other side is not responsive at all, and 481 call transaction doesn't exist means the session UAC refers to doesn't really exist on the user agent server. Once the session is established, any side can send out a re-invite request. In other words, an endpoint that was the user agent server during the session establishment could send a re-invite request to propose new session parameters. If a user agent server received an initial invite request, responded with a provisional response to create an earlier dialog, but gets a re-invite request before sending the final response to the initial invite request, will send back 500 server internal error. In my humble opinion, a 4xx client error with the reason phrase of "hold your horses" would be more proper than a 500 server internal error. And finally, a combination of the previous 2 points. If a user agent server of an established session sends out a re-invite request but receives another re-invite request without a response to its own, the user agent server will respond with 491 request pending response. Alright, we have discussed the out of dialog invite requests and in dialog invite requests, aka re-invite request. Now let's take a look at the by request and in which scenarios it's used. Naturally, the most common use is seen when an established session is teared down after the communication ends. Here, the by request can be sent by any end, UAC or UAS. In other words, any side can hang up the call. It doesn't matter who the caller or the callee is. The side who sends the buy request should immediately stop the media flow to and from the other end. The side that receives the buy request must follow the non-method specific procedure covered in previous tutorials to process the request. If the buy request doesn't match any existing dialog, a 481 call transaction doesn't exist response is generated. If the buy request matches an existing dialog, the dialog and the session are terminated with one exception. If the communication was a multicast session, one entity removing itself from the call should not cause the others to drop. That's why in a multicast session scenario, a buy request might not result in terminating the session at the receiving end. Now, it is worth noting that there are scenarios in which a buy request could be used after a non-2xx final response is received, but RFC 3261 recommends the use of cancel request in those scenarios. As for the scenarios when a provisional response is received, the following rules must be used to send buy requests. First of all, caller can send a buy request when the call is in early dialog stage or confirmed dialog stage. Callee cannot send a buy request when a call is in early dialog stage. However, callee can send a buy request when the call is in confirmed dialog stage. So that takes us to the end of our tutorial, in which we covered the invite request. If you have any questions or comments, please let us know. Thank you.